Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host Vikas Swarup. In this week's episode, we will tackle an issue that has been dominating the news headlines: climate change. And because this is a show that tries to make complex issues understandable to everyone, we will try to demystify climate change today. So let's begin with the basics. Climate change refers to long-term shifts in global temperatures and weather patterns which disrupt the usual balance of nature. And it is something that concerns us all. Take the example of a single event, Cyclone Amphan, which made landfall in West Bengal and Odisha last year. It affected 13 million people and caused over $13 billion in damage. Scientists say that tropical cyclones have become more destructive due to climate change. Take another example. We have all been experiencing warmer temperatures. Nearly all land areas are seeing more hot days and heat waves. 2020 was the hottest year in recorded history. This leads to water scarcity in more regions. Deserts are expanding, reducing land for growing food. Many people now face the threat of not having enough water on a regular basis. We are also seeing warming and acidification of the global oceans, melting of sea ice and glaciers, and rising sea levels, which threaten the very existence of small island states and low-lying regions. Changes in temperature also cause changes in rainfall. This results in more severe and frequent storms, flooding, and landslides. The main driver of climate change is the greenhouse effect. Some gases in the Earth's atmosphere act a bit like the glass in a greenhouse, trapping the sun's heat and stopping it from leaking back into space and causing global warming. Many of these greenhouse gases occur naturally, but human activity is increasing the concentrations of some of them in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide produced by human activities is the largest contributor to global warming, increasing global surface temperature at the rate of 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade since the 1970s. By 2020, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere had risen to 48% above its pre-industrial level, that is, before 1750. This, in turn, has led to global average temperature reaching 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. An increase of 2 degrees centigrade compared to the temperature in pre-industrial times could lead to catastrophic changes in the global environment. For this reason, the international community has recognized the need to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the mechanism to do this is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC entered into force on the 21st of March 1994. Today, it has near universal membership. The 197 countries that have ratified the convention are called parties to the convention. Every year, the parties to the convention meet in what is known as the COP, or Conference of the Parties, to take stock of the global fight against climate change. The COP is hosted by a different country each year ever since the first such meeting, COP1, took place in Berlin in 1995. It was a milestone and set the stage for the Kyoto Protocol 2 years later, which required wealthy, industrialized nations to curb emissions. That accord did not work because it didn't get the backing of the top emitters, the United States and China. Fast forward to 2015 and the COP21 in Paris, where leaders of nearly 200 countries signed the Paris Agreement, committing both rich and poor countries to act, albeit at different paces, to tackle climate change. Under this agreement, member countries voluntarily set targets for themselves for reducing their emissions by 2030 in the form of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. India is one of the few countries on track to achieve its Paris commitments well before the target date of 2030, but much of the world is lagging behind badly, leading the UN Secretary General to warn that the world is on a catastrophic path to 2.7 degrees centigrade heating by the end of the century. And that is why the COP26 meeting taking place in Glasgow becomes very important. India was represented at the summit-level segment by Prime Minister Modi himself, who highlighted India's vision for climate action as well as its leadership role. So what should we expect from COP26, and what is going to be India's stance and strategy at this critical conference? To answer these questions, I am joined by two outstanding experts. Dr. Sunita Narain is one of the world's leading environmentalists and authority on sustainable development who pushes for green changes in policies, practices, and mindsets. She has been with the Center for Science and Environment since 1982 and is currently its Director General. Ambassador Manjeev Puri is a former diplomat who has served as India's ambassador to Nepal, the European Union, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and has dealt with climate change issues for almost 2 decades, having been a key member of India's delegation at various climate change negotiations. He now serves on the advisory board of the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Let me begin with you, Dr. Narain. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has come out with its most alarming report yet on global warming, which has led the UN Secretary General to declare that it is nothing less than a code red for humanity. So tell us, why is the global fight against climate change in such a mess, and who is responsible?
So I think, Vikasji, the fact is that it is real. And I think the IPCC latest report is a dire warning. And so we should not make light of this. And I keep saying we don't even need scientists to tell us this anymore. I mean, we see it around us. You, in your introduction, have spelled it out so clearly that we are seeing everything from floods, droughts, extreme rain events. So we know climate change is real, and the fight against it is urgent. But you also know that it is from 1992 that the world has been struggling to be able to combat climate change. Now, the reason for this is that there is a very inconvenient truth when it comes to climate change. As you said, the gases that are responsible for climate change, greenhouse gases as they are called, have a very long residence time in the atmosphere. This simply means that when you emit in 1870, that gas is still in the atmosphere today. It has 150 to 200 years. So what happened in the past matters for the future. And it is that accumulation of gases in the atmosphere which is leading to the temperature rise. The most inconvenient truth is that countries, for their own progress, have emitted the gases. And if you look at it, it's basically the OECD countries. Till 2000, there were only 7 countries or 7 parts of the world, including EU 27, which are responsible for 70% of the emissions that have filled the atmospheric space. So when the world is talking about climate change, and given the fact that these emissions come because of economic reasons, they come because of the fuel we use to drive our economies, you're literally talking about not an ecology agreement, you're talking about an economic agreement. And the bottom line is you're talking about sharing atmospheric space between the already rich and the countries that will become rich. So it is that has led to this. And for the last 30 years, we have seen only the rich countries, the industrialized countries, wanting to do as little as possible and to shed the blame onto other countries like India. And in this, you have seen the growth of China, which since 2004, when it joined WTO, has huge emissions. So today, it is China and these countries, and there is no space for the rest to develop. This is the crisis of climate change. Climate justice, inequity, and the sharing of the atmospheric space.
Ambassador Puri, you heard Prime Minister Modi at the World Leaders Summit of COP26, where he presented India's climate change agenda. What were the main points that he made, and how has India shown leadership in climate action?
So when you mentioned what did Prime Minister Modi say, let me tell you, his first intervention was in a plenary not so well covered, which was with Boris Johnson, President Biden, where he stressed the need for adaptation and for adaptation to be recognized, to be mainstreamed, and for action on that, including huge global support. Because the need for adaptation is among those who don't have the resilience among themselves. India is certainly one of them. And let me draw your attention. We set up the CDRI, and at this COP, we did something particularly good for the most vulnerable, the small island developing states, in setting up this thing called IRIS, which is infrastructure. Infrastructure lasts forever if you make it resilient for something for which they have no responsibility. They will never have responsibility. They are not the largest emitters, they can't be, but they are the ones which are most vulnerable. Little bit of sea level rise, it can lead to existentialist issues. This was one of the big sets of issues. We've also done something about solar energy, another one of the big things of India. The one sun, one world, one grid, along with British initiatives, all good ideas that we've put forward. But let me make the big points regarding India and our contribution.
Yes.
The first thing I want to tell you is, the Prime Minister spoke a little longer than what was allowed, and at the end of it, he said something very nice. He said, I seek your indulgence for having spoken longer, because I spoke for the developing world. Now, you and I and all of us know that India values being member of the developing world. We set up the G77. We've always spoken strongly. And we still are a developing country, even though we are a member of the G20. We are nowhere near China on that particular stuff. Therefore, when we speak, we carry voice. And it's the voice of the developing country, which was perhaps, in my opinion, this solidarity and putting it forward, which was important. And then he said, will India lag behind? What did he say essentially? India is one of the countries which walks the talk on what it says on climate. So that is why we are a country which is about to reach its Paris commitments. What did the Prime Minister say in terms of India's strong contribution? We have been leaders in the area of renewable energy, taking on onerous targets suo moto, all by ourselves, nothing to do with Paris, nothing. We had said 450 gigawatts. He has upped it to 500 gigawatts, a huge incremental jump. And believe me, with no prompting of anyone, we are doing it as a result of our own conviction. And then he says, we will do 50% of our total amounts of installed electricity generation through renewables. Again, such a big commitment stands taken. And then finally add something else. Two other points very important. That in terms of what India would emit from now to 2030 in a 10-year period, there'd be a 1 billion tons reduction in emissions. You know, many people would say, that's truly onerous. Should we have done it? Many of us would question these particular needs because they are things. But, you know, we've been bold and ambitious. And then finally, the whole world is talking about net zero by 2050. You know, if it was a global goal of net zero by 2050, following the principles of the UNFCCC, especially common but differentiated, many of us would say, no problem, we should go ahead because of the urgency. But that wasn't the way the theme was set out. It was accept net zero by 2050 by all countries. You accept yourself, which meant differentiation completely finished much more than Paris. And there he made the point, something that other countries have also done, but highlighted that India has huge development imperatives. And 2050 would not only negate the principles of common but differentiated, but also not be possible given our development space that we need. And so he announced 2070. Let me make this point. It is very bold, it is very ambitious, but it is giving the direction that India will be one of the largest geographies for climate action, no matter what happens in the human burden sharing negotiations at the UNFCCC.
Dr. Narain, Ambassador Puri mentioned the fact that the $100 billion that was promised in climate finance for developing countries is nowhere near being realized. In fact, I believe the target date has now been shifted to 2023 from 2020. So tell us, what is the report card on the issue of climate financing, and how can developing countries get access to technology and finance to meet their climate change commitments?
So Vikasji, first let's understand why climate finance, because often people think, oh, this is why are developing countries asking for money. I often get asked this question, particularly from Western media, that India is a rich country or a getting rich country. Why are you asking for money? Let's understand. The fact is, when you looked at 1992, and I talked about the figures, you had a set of countries, and they're literally just top 7 countries of the world, that contributed to the stock of greenhouse gas emissions. So when the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, the agreement was very simple. And I think the simplicity was, the beauty of it was in the simplicity of it. It said that the rich have to reduce, they need to make space for the poor to grow, which is the right to development, which is the CBDR that Manjeev talked about. They have the right to grow, they have the right to development. But so that development will be different, there will be money and technology provided so that they can grow, but they can grow differently. So it was part of the deal. It was a green deal in the interest of all, and most importantly, in the interest of the planet. Now, since then to now, as I said, there has been very little which has really been delivered in terms of climate finance, certainly not even in technology transfer. The big turnaround came in Paris when it was put down as part of the agreement, 100 billion. But the most ironical issue is, and I think our Prime Minister and our Finance Minister, in fact, in Washington, called it out very clearly, saying that what is very bad is that they haven't even agreed on a definition today on what is climate finance. Okay? Now, as a result of it, you have an OECD report which says that they are close to reaching 100 billion. You have a report coming out from the governments of Canada and Germany which say it is close and it will be there in 2023. But the fact is, when Oxfam, which is a British charity, as you know, decoded some of these, what was called climate finance, they found everything was called climate finance. So everything from even a payment for the building of a road or a private loan was called climate finance. CSC, my organization, we looked at what was happening in the area of solar energy. And the US was actually calling climate finance the money that its Exim Bank was paying or loaning us
also as
climate finance. So I think what we now need is, let's understand that we have an interdependent world. I mean, COVID has taught us that we have a deadly race between the virus, the variant, and vaccination. Even G7, G20 now accepts the fact that nobody is safe till all are safe. It's the same with climate change. If they polluted in the past, we will grow and we will pollute in the future. We need an agreement which is just, which is equitable, which leads to global cooperation. And for that, the most important driver of that is going to be the rebuilding of global trust between countries. And that's where a measurable verification of what is climate finance becomes critical.
Ambassador Puri, India, which accounts for 17.8% of the global population, contributes only 5% of global emissions. Yet, there has always been pressure on India to raise its climate commitments. So what should be India's negotiating strategy at COP26? And what are the key issues for India at this important conference?
Because this is, of course, if I may use this expression, the million-dollar question as far as we are concerned. While you have very rightly highlighted, and Prime Minister made this point, that India is a very low per capita emitter. The world says, but you are very large in aggregate terms. The Americans always refer to us as major emitters. And the whole idea of major economies only came about because they wanted us to go, and we said we will not go under major emitters. So they changed the name to major economies. We all know what is happening. India, I think I should point out to your viewers, not only is it that our per capita emissions are low, they are so low that today at about 3 tons per capita, we are far less than the global average, let alone what the developed countries are doing. The United States, I think I must make this point to your people, today emits 16 tons per capita. The Chinese are fairly high. The Europeans continue to remain fairly high, without any doubt. And I'm not talking about oil-rich countries, etc., where the development models are very different. What is our strategy? I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the fundamental thing that we need to safeguard in our strategy is our development space. And why do I say that? India is a country which is wedded to multilateralism. We are not the kind of country which takes multilateral commitments and looks the other way. This is something which the biggest players have done, both on the developing side as well as in the developed world. But we don't, which is why we made it our effort to meet the Paris Agreement's goals. We therefore are very serious about what we do and ensuring that our development space does not get crimped. It's all very well to talk about futuristic technologies, hydrogen, renewables. But the fact of the matter is their implementation, even in the developed world and elsewhere, is progressing only apace, nothing more than that. We need to see what can happen. Sunita just mentioned this thing about COVID. Well, you know, we've taken a huge dip in terms of our economic growth. The world has taken a huge dip. The world is coming back. What would be the very first set of priorities? You have to do something in terms of building back. That's most important. I would like that the building back is green. There is no doubt in my mind. But let us also not forget this fact that building back is perhaps the more important element of that. You need to ensure the greenness. You need to try and do something. You are unlikely to get support. That is the fact of the matter. So our basic focus has to be the development space as far as India is concerned. Secondly, we need to ensure that the documents that come out, which are soft law in the world, continue to exert pressure on the developed world to actually walk the talk, i.e. reduce their emissions and be serious on technology transfer, finance and capacity building. We need to try and bind them, and then at least when they walk away, they look bad in terms of what they've done. These need to be the core elements of what we've done. Recognition is one thing, but putting it down in soft law is particularly important.
I think it's very important for us to put pressure on the front loading of emissions. This 2050, 2070, too far away. We need to talk about it now. And we need a very credible, clear roadmap for how the developed world will front load its emissions by 2030, number one. Number two, China has to be on the spotlight. China is the largest emitter. The scale of it is 10 gigawatts of China a year. US is 5, India is 2.5. So please understand the scaling of this. China will occupy 33% of the available carbon budget between now and 2030. China has to be on the spotlight. China cannot be given a free pass. I keep saying China is yesterday's United States. For 30 years, the US blocked the agreement on climate change because it was not convenient for it. China is yesterday's United States. China has to be on the spotlight, number two. Number three, finance, we have already discussed that. Number four, I think the most critical issue now is going to be, and this is the issue, there is a rule book, as you know, the Paris rule book is going to be discussed. Rule number 6, it's markets. Now, my fear, and I have some tension on this with some of my colleagues, but my fear is that we do not want another convoluted, cheap development mechanism like CDM. The markets have to be used for the clean development mechanism. So the Kyoto Protocol also had markets, and they essentially argued that it is cheaper for us to invest in the developing world for the same amount of carbon abatement as it is than it is to invest in our country. Yes. So we will invest in your country, but whatever is the carbon saved will go into our account book. Now, CDM became a very cheap, convoluted, corrupt development mechanism. It was designed so, because it was designed to capture the low-hanging fruit in our world. Today's market has to be based on transformational action. We are saying that the market has to be driven to say it will invest only when the cost of transformation is high in the developing world. And that's the main. Related to this is what you saw yesterday is what is called nature-based solution. It simply means investment in carbon sequestration which comes out of forests. Now, again, our forests are not carbon sticks. Our forests are habitats of our people. Our forests have value. They need to be paid for in labor terms, and the benefits have to go to communities. So that agreement cannot become another agreement where the rich world is looking for a free pass. Lastly, and I think most critically, which we need to put on the agenda, is an agreement on loss and damage. The Paris Agreement actually is one of the worst agreements that the world could have signed. It has erased the concept of historical responsibility. It is highly inequitable. But worse, when it comes to loss and damage, it says that even if you discuss loss and damage, you cannot discuss the issue of liability and compensation. Now, today, scientists have reached a point where they can attribute that any extreme weather event, how much of the impact is because of climate change. If that is the case, why are we not letting the polluters pay? Why are we not insisting that the polluters have to pay for the cost of the damage in the developing world? So those, I think, are big agendas for COP. My worry, however, is, and forgive me, you both come from that profession, but my worry is that COPs have become so ossified. They have become so full of institutions, words, funds without money, that they have lost the big plot. And I think that's where we need to make sure that we can drive the agenda, because climate change does affect us.
Dr. Narain, there is increasing pressure on India to phase out coal. But currently, India relies on coal for 70% of its power needs. So what is the way forward?
So for me, the agenda going forward would be as follows. One, and I think the government of India has also, in its targets that the Prime Minister laid down in Glasgow, has kind of alluded to this. One, we will not phase out coal, but we will not grow coal further. In my view, we need to do two more things. We need to phase out the really old ones. We have 35 gigawatts of really old, inefficient, dirty plants. They need to go and be replaced by either ultra super critical plants or by other plants like gas plants, so that we can have cleaner energy. That would be the first. The second one would be that the coal-based thermal power plants need to have emission standards. We need to energize our discoms, clean them up, get our energy systems going so that they are working on clean energy, and that we get rid of the dirty sources of energy that are being used.
We are running out of time, so final question. What are your expectations from COP26? Will it be another talk shop? Will it be a success? Very shortly, very short answers, Ambassador Puri.
The fact that urgency is needed is something which stands recorded. The fact that adaptation would have to be addressed and cannot be merely a lip service is something that is recorded. Secondly, these ideas that you have to bring your emissions down to zero at some particular point of time stands accepted. Insofar as the whole idea of everybody at net zero 2050, I am so glad that it would appear that this idea, given the fact that it went against the fundamental principles, etc., has in a sense been put to rest for the time being. I personally think this would be a useful COP, but I do think that there would have to be negotiations in the coming years.
Dr. Narain?
Very quickly, to me, this is a make or break movement, only because I think we need the urgency to move ahead. We need the signals that the world is aware. And to me, I get a lot of, I've been in this for long. I've been to most of the COPs. But I think there is a difference in the air, and that is coming from the cold anger of the young people. When I see the young on the streets today, and I see that they understand what catastrophe awaits them, and they are willing to somewhere to walk the talk, I think that gives me a sense of hope that we will accept that this is real. But I think my biggest fear is that we don't do it on the backs of the poor in the world.
On that optimistic note, we must conclude this episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Let me thank both my guests for their wonderful insights. See you next week. Till then, Good evening and goodbye.